Hey everybody, this is a piece titled, quote, "By Any Means Necessary," end quote. Authoritarianism and the Potential for Violence in Anti-Zionist Postcolonial Discourse by Ingo Elbe. This is from 2025. First section. Students for Hamas. Since the massacre of the 7th of October 2023, a wave of hatred against Israel has been flooding Western universities, and on American campuses in particular, there has been a radicalization of unanticipated proportions. At demonstrations at Columbia University, one activist clutched a sign pointed in the direction of students waving the Israeli flag bearing the words, quote, "Al-Qassam's next targets," end quote, a reference to the military arm of Hamas and an open death threat against fellow students. And you can look that up at documenting Jew hatred on campuses at Columbia U on X. A leader of the anti-Israeli student movement at Columbia, who previously claimed he hates white people, stated unequivocally, quote, "Zionists don't deserve to live. Be grateful that I'm not just going out and murdering Zionists," end quote. Footnote. See the article by Olivia Land, Banned Columbia Anti-Israel Camp Ringleader Kaimani James once said they, quote, "hate white people and wanted to work for AOC." New York Post, April 27, 2024. End footnote. Jewish students are often the targets of taunts such as, quote, "go back to Poland," end quote. Footnote. See Stephen Vago and Isabel Keene's article, "Anti-Israel Protester Screams Go Back to Poland at demonstrators with Israeli flag outside of Columbia. Harrowing video shows." Published in the New York Post, 21st of April 2024. End footnote. Cries such as "glory to Hamas" or, quote, "burn Tel Aviv to the ground," end quote, can frequently be heard on campuses. In Princeton, a student with an acoustic guitar and keffiyeh sat with a Hezbollah flag spread out in front of him like a picnic blanket. This phenomenon has hardly been limited to the United States. In Germany, for example, death threats against pro-Israel faculty and institutions in the form of red Hamas triangles are widespread, as are protest camps calling for the expulsion of 7 million Jews from, quote, Palestine, end quote. Footnote. See an article by Franziska Apfel et al. No, I'm just going to stop reading all these citations because it's just annoying. No wonder that such students who generally speak out in favor of boycotting Israeli institutions and academics and against the Jewish state's right to exist without distancing themselves from Hamas have earned praise from Islamist despots. In an open letter signed by Ayatollah Khomeini, protesting students in the U.S. were described as, quote, "being on the right side of history," end quote. One especially symbolic image of the unrestrained hatred of elements of the left-wing academic elite was provided by a hooded student at the protest at Morningside Heights, who held a sign to the cameras that read, quote, "Columbia, why require me to read Professor Edward Said if you don't want me to use it," end quote. Indeed, postcolonial theory, which was largely influenced by Said and now has been widely adopted in many segments of academia, is to a great degree the intellectual underpinning of current developments. According to its proponents, colonialism, whether in education or social structures, outlasted the end of formal colonial rule. The motif of, quote, coloniality, end quote, is a collective term for the diagnosis of a Western world order that supposedly has, for over 500 years, imposed poverty, racist exclusion, and genocide on the so-called global South. Coloniality is established as the prism through which historical observation and social criticism are made. According to this grand new narrative, this principle also provides a key to understanding Judaism, Zionism, anti-Semitism, and the Shoah. This results in systematic theoretical distortions, the conceptual dissolution of anti-Semitism into racism, the relativization of the Holocaust as a colonial crime, the demonization of Israel, and the suppression of Islamic and Arab anti-Semitism. Our focus here, however, will be on the apologetics used to justify terror against Israel and the readiness to ally with jihadist and authoritarian movements/regimes through the use of the motif of coloniality. New section. Coloniality is, quote, structural genocide, end quote. The overwhelming majority of post-colonial thinkers regard Israel as the incarnation of all Western colonial crimes and hold it responsible for the extirpation of an indigenous people. Said's claims that Israel was founded on the, quote, negation of Palestine and the Palestinians, end quote, and that since 1948 the Jewish state has attempted to, quote, objectively eliminate the Palestinians, end quote, are the foundational model for this reasoning. The many gaping holes of the various versions of that Zionism equals colonialism thesis have already been identified. It has been repeatedly noted that Zionism never sought the cultural, let alone physical, elimination of the Palestinian Arabs. On the contrary, their numbers have grown, and Israeli Arabs enjoy far-reaching civic equality and cultural autonomy. Before 1948, Jewish organizations had bought land. They didn't illegally expropriate the land. In any case, most land was not in the hands of private Arab owners, and an Arab-Palestinian state had never existed. Originally, there was no ideology of expulsion in mainstream Zionist thought. The flight of many Arabs and the expulsion of others in 1948 should rather be seen as a consequence of the Arab War of Aggression and the experience of the Yishuv, Jewish community of pre-state Palestine, with successive Arab pogroms in 1920, 1921, 1929, and 1936. The Zionist willingness to compromise and to recognize an Arab state alongside a Jewish state on the territory of the former British Mandate had already been demonstrated by their approval of the UN partition plan in 1947. For the Jews of the Yishuv, there was no possibility of decamping to a colonial mother country. Such a motherland never existed. Time and again, even before the official inauguration of the British Mandate, and with the subsequent temporary immigration restrictions of 1929, until the British finally turned away from supporting the creation of a Jewish national home in December 1937, Britain had instead, and precisely out of imperial considerations, combined pro-Arab appeasement with anti-Zionist measures. Zionism was never intended to exploit the Arabs and actually led to the improvement in their standard of living. Jews have been an indigenous people in the region for over 3,000 years, and the Zionist immigrants had to be understood as a transnational community of refugees from European and Arab countries in which they had experienced anti-Semitic discrimination and persecution. Zionism has primarily represented a, quote, civilizing mission, end quote, in relation to its own people, and a protective and normalizing mission directed outward. To be sure, all of this went hand in hand with Eurocentric notions of superiority and real territorial conflicts, but also with positive Orientalism and a partial Hebraization of culture. None of this hinders settler colonial studies, which represents an undercurrent of post-colonial thinking, aided by the deliberate omission of decisive but inconvenient information, and causal connections in the history of the Arab-Zionist conflict, in the canonical reference works of postcolonial hostility to Israel, above all, Ilan Pappé's The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, Rashid Khalidi's The 100 Years' War in Palestine, and the manifesto of Shlomo Sound, who denies the continuity of the Jewish people. That discipline subsumes the history of Zionism in its entirety under the template of settler colonialism. Patrick Wolf, a major figure in settler colonial studies, understands Zionism as the appropriation of indigenous land by non-indigenous people, in the course of which the, quote, original owners of the land, are eliminated, end quote. Patrick Wolf maintains, quote, this logic certainly requires the elimination of the owners of that territory, but not in any particular way, end quote. Patrick Wolf. Quote, elimination, end quote, could therefore take all possible forms, including assimilation, the granting of citizenship, or the promotion of mixed marriages. According to this view, every form of the, quote, dissolution of native societies, end quote, every form of the establishment of a new society, and every form of interaction between settlers and indigenous people constitutes settler colonialism and, quote, structural genocide, end quote, and should be condemned. Patrick Wolf also sees eliminatory continuities or, quote, genocidal moments, end quote, of settler violence in the high number of indigenous children who require the services of social workers, in, quote, disproportionate indigenous incarceration rates and zonal police deployments, end quote, as well as in the, quote, cross-frontier regime of exception that Israel imposes on Gaza and the ongoing exclusion of refugees, end quote. Patrick Wolf. What is striking about these concepts of colonialism and genocide is not only their grotesque inflation, and they have been flanked to right-wing ethno-pluralist notions of unconditional culturalism, but also their Manichaean binary logic and use of stereotypes which disregards any historical context and above all the actions of the, quote, indigenous. The fact that even acts such as the granting of Israeli citizenship, cultural assimilation, or familial mixing can be subsumed under the rubric of genocide, as well as the opposite, ethnic separation, and that no questions are asked about the reasons for police operations and border regimes or the status of refugees makes this approach a universally deployable weapon of activist social science against Israel. The philosopher Balázs Berkovits, I have some pieces by him on this channel, he's from Hungary, I believe, offers a concise critique of this phenomenon, stating, quote, no empirical finding could refute the potentiality, which is here taken to be equivalent with the actuality, of genocide understood in this extremely flexible yet essentialized manner. Patrick Wolf is relativizing genocide, a concept forged by reference to the Holocaust, while at the same time using the powerful imagery associated with it and turning it against Israel. End quote. Balázs Berkovits. Lorenzo Veracini, one of the leading proponents of settler colonialism studies, takes the indigeneity fetish to the point of granting the Palestinians a, quote, place-based existence, end quote, and goes on to proclaim that they, quote, entertain an ontological relationship, end quote, with the land. Jews, however, can in this view at best assert, quote, historical claims, and can never be considered truly indigenous. As Ilan Pappé depicts Palestinian society before the Jews began their land acquisition as a, quote, paradisiacal primal state, end quote, in which exploitation, patriarchal rule, and religious conflicts do not seem to exist. While Zionism appears as a land-hungry monster that destroys primordial harmony and kills off life itself. It is not difficult to recognize in settler colonialism studies, the Occidentalist stereotypes that already appear in Said's Question of Palestine, which amounts to a, quote, essentialist and, quote, condemnation of the West as a, quote, mass of soulless, decadent, money-grubbing, rootless, faithless, unfeeling parasites, end quote, that threatens the, quote, indigenous, end quote, peoples and cultures imagined as quasi-natural and homogeneous. And that quote was from Ian Baruma and Avishai Margalit, Occidentalism, the West in the Eyes of Its Enemies. It's not difficult to recognize in settler colonial studies the Occidentalist stereotypes that already appear in Said's Question of Palestine, which amounts to a, quote, essentialist condemnation of the West as a, quote, mass of soulless, decadent, money-grubbing, rootless, faithless, unfeeling parasites, end quote, that threaten the, quote, indigenous peoples and cultures imagined as quasi-natural and homogeneous. Historian Johannes Becker, who also discovers Occidentalist stereotypes in the post-colonial image of Israel that operate with a, quote, culturalist fundamental attribution error, end quote. Quote, a tendency of people to make dispositional attributions for the behavior of others, even when there are clear external environmental causes, end quote. By identifying Israel as part of the global, quote, West, explanations for its state building, including its territorial expansion, focus not on strategic considerations, regional power dynamics, or historical context, but rather on presumably deep-rooted and trans-temporal characteristics. In particular, a colonialist will to power, a rootless and cosmopolitan civilization, contempt for the, quote, natives, and an unquenchable thirst for material resources, end quote. Johannes Becker. The demonization of Israel has long been de rigueur in this academic discourse and takes various forms. One often finds unabashedly anti-Semitic tropes grafted onto Israel. Occidentalism already exhibits such motifs, as the Jews have recurrently been accused of being rootless, materialistic, hyper-rationalistic, and culturally subversive. Veracini links these features to the image of the vampire, which has much in common with the anti-Semitic stereotype of the bloodthirsty, parasitic Jew. Quote, horrific tales about an encounter that produces death, or an assimilation that is a type of death. Vampire stories are inherently settler colonial stories. If we look at these stories from the point of view of an indigenous collective, the links are indeed apparent. Vampires, after all, are pale, exotic beings that empty the land and are obsessed about owning it, end quote. Lorenzo Veracini, The Settler Colonial Present. Judith Butler applies the anti-Jewish motif of the Christian legend of ritual murder to Israel by speaking of the Israeli, quote, murder of children, end quote. Butler's accusation that Jews who defend a nation-state betray their essence, which consists of a diaspora existence and surrender to the other, is reminiscent of the myth of the Jew condemned to eternal wandering. For Butler, quote, the exilic, is built into the idea of the Jewish, In this sense, to be, quote, be a Jew is to be departing from oneself, end quote. Butler, Parting Ways, Jewishness and the Critique of Zionism. Similarly, and on the surface contradicting Occidentalism, the French philosopher Alain Badiou contrasts the, quote, true Jew, end quote, which he suggests is really a metaphor for all migrants, minorities and revolutionaries, and the supposedly cosmopolitan, quote, truly contemporary states, end quote, with the particularist and, quote, archaic Israel. See Badiou, Polemics. This presents a modified topos of Christian anti-Judaism, which saw the, quote, carnal, end quote, Jew as an obdurate relic of the past, and the Christian as the spiritual continuation and replacement of the Jew. In a strange twist, the anti-Semitic image of the permanently identity-subverting, all-undermining, and corrosive Jew becomes a role model for postmodern ideologues, as long as the, quote, rootless Jew, end quote, leads a modest diaspora or dhimmi existence. Quote, the Jew as victim becomes an ideal, end quote. Anita Shapira. In an article, The Debate Over the, quote, New Historians of Israel. The eternal subversion of values and the rejection of borders are declared the new norm, and Jews who refuse to subscribe to it, for example, because they defend themselves against physical annihilation as a national entity in the form of Zionism, are fought against as the epitome of toxic colonial and sovereign identity. This is where the notorious equation of Nazism in Israel comes in. Zionism allegedly perpetuates the idea of nationalism, which led to the Holocaust. That is why prominent representatives of the post-colonials, such as Wolf or Mahmoud Mamdani, resort to grotesque analogies. This is nothing new. For some years now, they have been comparing the situation in Gaza or the West Bank to Nazi concentration camps, or at least the Warsaw Ghetto. Etienne Balabar accuses Israel of, quote, killing for the sake of killing, end quote, in Gaza, while Ahil Mbembe describes as a Zionist, quote, necropolicy, end quote, that seeks the, quote, carnage, destruction, and incremental extermination, end quote, of the Palestinians and represents, quote, the biggest moral scandal of our times. Mbembe thus places Israeli policy towards the Palestinians in a biopolitical continuity of the, quote, final solution, understands Israel as a hostile and deadly anti-community, and presents it as the main enemy of all people interested in, quote, world repair, end quote. Patrick Wolf uses the formulation of a, quote, Goyim reign, bracket Gentile free, in bracket zone, end quote. Patrick Wolf, to describe the principle of Jewish work in Zionism, and thus even liken Zionism to a precursor of National Socialism. For Ramon Grossfogel, Zionism is simply, quote, Hitlerism, end quote, in which Jews are allegedly engaged to hunt down Palestinians. New section, non-metaphorical decolonization and redemptive anti-Zionism. According to Adam Kirsch, the loss of a universalist orientation toward the future with relatively clear ideas of social order, such as liberal capitalism or a socialist planned economy, accompanied by cultural relativism and indigeneity fetishes, often leads settler colonialism studies to a rigoristic fixation on the past. This nudges settler colonialism studies towards, quote, politics of the impossible, end quote, and its, quote, impossible necessary task, end quote, as Butler calls the destruction of the Jewish state. Adam Kirsch maintains, quote, if the definition of a progressive movement is that it believes that the future can be better than the past, then the ideology of settler colonialism is not progressive because it believes the past was better, end quote. Adam Kirsch. For example, the search for a so-called, quote, just peace, end quote, the watchword of Palestinian revanchism and its Western accomplices regarding the Arab-Israeli conflict, conveys the idea of undoing a supposed colonial injustice by dismantling the society that has emerged from this injustice, and which is depicted as colonial settler colonial entity. As colonial settler entity. Colonial, quote, invasion is recognized as a structure rather than an event, end quote, states Wolf. As demonstrated above, this is also linked to the romanticization of the quote indigenous unquote community, which in the context on which we have focused is rooted in the myth of the peaceful coexistence of Jews, Christians, and Muslims in Islamic societies. The hatred of Jews, whether past or present in such societies, is completely ignored, and in the best case, the purported quote multiculturalism and quote of yesteryear's Islam, which degraded Jews de jure or de facto to the status of dhimmis, thus becomes a blueprint for the future in the form of a conservative revolution. Since the descendants of the one-time real or supposed colonialist interlopers are also pejoratively described as, quote, settlers, and the idea of the indefeasible indigeneity of the land, its eternal connection to an original community, is axiomatic. Decolonization in extreme cases even amounts to a downright apocalyptical program of struggle against the colonial evil incarnated in the settler, Kirsch continues, which would lead to the mass expulsion and mass murder of those real or supposed settlers. Gross-Vogel, for example, insists that in the struggle against Israel, quote, the future of humanity is at stake, end quote. What we are dealing with here is classic redemptive anti-Zionism. In Mein Kampf, Hitler wrote, quote, if, the Jew is victorious over other peoples of the world, his crown will be the funeral wreath of humanity, and this planet will, as it did thousands of years ago, move through the ether devoid of men. Hence today I believe that I am acting in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator. By defending myself against the Jew, I am fighting for the work of the Lord, end quote. Hitler, Mein Kampf. Today, Gross-Vogel applies this to the Jewish state as follows, quote, we find ourselves in a deeply spiritual and messianic moment. Either we organize and stop this injustice, bracket, the alleged genocide in Gaza and the Jewish state, Ingo Elbe, in bracket, or we move unfailingly towards the destruction of life on planet Earth, end quote. Gross-Vogel. Yeah, this is something that you also see in a lot of people. It's like capitalism's going to stop existing if Israel stops existing. Climate change will be fixed if Israel stops existing. Gross-Vogel further maintains, quote, the freedom of Palestine will be a major defeat to Western imperialist forces and will support the struggle for the affirmation of life. The Palestinian victory will take humanity to a higher level of consciousness, end quote. Gross-Vogel. Accordingly, anti-Israeli campaigns now proclaim, quote, Palestine will set us free, end quote. According to U.S. activist Linda Sarsour, the supposedly white Jewish settlers may even be dehumanized. With regard to Zionists, she warned, quote, if you're actually trying to humanize the oppressor, that's a problem, end quote. Here, today's ideologues are applying Frantz Fanon's violence-glorifying ideas, a precursor to postcolonial theory, to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Fanon praised the community building, quote, absolute violence, end quote, against the colonial master without any moral restraint. Islamic activist Huria Bouteldia, I can't remember how to pronounce this person's name, Bouteldia, supported by post-colonials such as Cornel West, modifies an infamous passage from Sartre's preface to Fanon's magnum opus, quote, killing an Israeli is killing two birds with one stone, eliminating in one go oppressor and oppressed, leaving one dead man and the other free, end quote. And in their essay titled Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, the title which became a widespread slogan after October 7th, decolonial theorist Eve Tuck and K. Wayne Yang call for a, quote, reinvasion, end quote, of indigenous land. Reconciliation and participation in wealth and the enjoyment of rights as well as peace on the other hand, are explicitly not goals of genuine non-metaphorical decolonization. Rather, this follows a, quote, ethic of incommensurability, end quote, that does not care what consequences the reinvasion of the colonized land will have for the settlers. Quote, decolonization is not accountable to settlers or settler futurity, ... To fully enact an ethic of incommensurability means relinquishing settler futurity, abandoning the hope that settlers may one day be commensurable to native peoples, end quote. Eve Tuck and K. Wayne Yang. Decolonization is not a metaphor. However, in the case of Tuck and Yang, the permanent termination of the moral unity of the human species also affects people of color. After all, African Americans or Hispanics in the U.S., for example, are not the, quote, original, unquote, owners of the land and thus benefit from settler colonialism by gaining equal civil rights, they argue. It is left to, quote, indigenous sovereignty alone, end quote, similar alone to serve as the guide in deciding what happens to them after reinvasion. Similarly, the Hamas murder gangs on the 7th of October were not interested in whether they abducted Arab Israelis or migrant workers alongside Jews. In Tuck and Yang's logic, they are all, quote, brown settlers, end quote. Tuck and Yang. And in The Question of Palestine, Said too quotes a poem by Mahmoud Darwish, which he calls the, quote, national poem, end quote, of the Palestinian people, without any hint of criticism. It reads, quote, if I become hungry, the usurper's flesh will be my food. Beware, beware of my hunger and my anger, end quote. It is only logical that student activists who have been exposed to such teachers for years believe any and all action directed against Israelis to be legitimate. The phrase, quote, by any means necessary, end quote, is a mantra that strongly reverberates among the pro-Hamas left at Western universities. No wonder, then, that Columbia professor Joseph Massad celebrated the murder, rape, and abduction of Israeli citizens and the jubilant reactions of Palestinian civilians as, quote, stunning, quote, awesome, quote, remarkable, and, quote, astonishing. The flight of Israeli citizens from their cities, which he called the, quote, colonists' flight from these settlements, ... may prove, end quote, Joseph Massad hopes, quote, to be a permanent exodus, end quote. Finally, the postmodern political scientist Jodi Dean, who, to my understanding, I'm not exactly sure, I haven't read her work, so I might be talking out my ass a little bit here, is trying to basically revitalize Marxist-Leninist Stalinism as a mode of politics. She's written things about communism in that vein with clowns like Slavoj Žižek, for instance. Finally, the postmodern political scientist Jodi Dean found the images of the Hamas paragliders, quote, exhilarating, and recognizes, quote, seemingly impossible acts of bravery and defiance, end quote, in Hamas terror. She defends Hamas and takes, quote, the side of the Palestinian resistance, responding to a revolutionary subject, the subject fighting against occupation and oppression, end quote. And her blog post is tellingly entitled, Palestine Speaks for Everyone, end quote. Terror here appears merely as a silent act of impotent justice. The paternalistic and projected partisanship for the supposed underdog, from whose violence nothing less than redemption is expected, is the pitiful remnant of a former left-wing critique of power. The more elegant strategy, however, is the demonization of Israel cloaked in humanistic terms through the denial of Arab agency and anti-Semitic violence, as found in the popular, quote, contextualizations, end quote, of the October pogrom. And an open letter signed by leading scholars of postcolonial studies, such as A. Dirk Moses and Michael Rothberg, but also by Omer Bartov and Stephanie Schuler Springorum, who heads the Center for Research on Anti-Semitism at the Technical University of Berlin, Israel alone is identified as the first cause of the anti-Semitic mass murder by Hamas. Quote, 75 years of displacement, 56 years of occupation, and 16 years of the Gaza blockade, end quote. It says, quote, have generated an ever-deteriorating spiral of violence that can only be arrested by political solution, end quote. Omer Bartov, Christoph R. Browning, Michael Rothberg et al. In an open letter on the misuse of Holocaust memory. Arab pogroms against the Yishuv in the 1920s, 30s, the Palestinian refusal to accept a Jewish state, the wars of aggression waged by Arab armies against Israel, and its peace offers in 2000 and 2008 are completely ignored. Israel appears as a, quote, contextless context, end quote, for Palestinian terrorism. Palestinians appear merely as reacting figures. Their terror is anonymized in the formulation of the, quote, spiral of violence, end quote. New section. Epistemic ethno-relativism, hybridity, and the open flank to Islamism. This form of demonization may be decontextualization is ultimately also based on a central methodological defect of postcolonial studies. Edward Said's concept of Orientalist, quote, othering, a key tenet of postcolonial thinking. The West invents the image of a degraded Oriental, quote, other in order to define itself, to free itself imaginarily from negative parts of itself, and to justify an imperial claim to power. In so doing, Said's theory cultivates a, quote, double standard, end quote, whereby only the way the, quote, West speaks about the, quote, global South is examined and criticized. Whether those supposed, quote, Western statements about the, quote, global South hold any truth or not does not matter. The expression of such statements alone is understood as an illegitimate colonial power strategy. Said even claims that European actors can per se only paint a distorted picture of the Orient. The, quote, global South appears solely as a victim or mute projection surface and is thus conceptually incapacitated. Bernard Lewis spoke ironically of the, quote, white man's burden of guilt, end quote, a negative Eurocentrism and superiority thinking that assumes that only white Europeans could be responsible for the world's ills. The, quote, others, end quote, for example, Islamist regimes and movements such as Iran or Hamas, are usually not even mentioned as actors. When, exceptionally, their violent deeds or power relations are discussed, they're not taken seriously. Anti-Jewish statements are trivialized as the mere rhetoric of desperate victims, and their behavior is interpreted as a marginal response to the actions of the West or Israel. However, variants of postcolonial thinking that are considered more complex also have systematic pitfalls. In their epistemic, quote, ethno-relativism, end quote, as the South African philosopher George Hall calls the decolonial knowledge paradigm, we are dealing with an authoritarian, culturally relativistic, and inconsistent conception of knowledge. It is authoritarian because it places individuals and their critical faculties under the a priori validity of predetermined collective knowledge systems. According to Sabelo J. Lovu Getsheni, quote, decolonial attitude, begins from accepting that all human beings are born into valid and legitimate knowledge systems, end quote. George Hall aptly states, quote, ethno-relativism makes impossible the following thought, which universalism positively encourages, that not only an individual but also a large group of people over many generations, could be entirely wrong in all or almost all of what they believe, end quote. George Hall. It is culturally relativistic because these knowledge systems are thought of in the plural and are made dependent on culturally specific geopolitical determinants. For example, Gross-Fogel claims that, quote, the disembodied and unlocated neutrality and objectivity ... of knowledge is a Western myth, end quote, that results from the, quote, imperial being, end quote, of Europeans. Footnote, see Gross-Fogel's article, Decolonizing Postcolonial Studies and Paradigms of Political Economy, Transmodernity, Decolonial Thinking, and Global Coloniality. Gross-Fogel insists that each speaker is notably determined by their respective, quote, ethnic, racial, gender, sexual, epistemic location, end quote. In his concept of geopolitics/body politics of knowledge, Walter Mignolo similarly assumes that it is the located body of the colonized that determines thought. I have a piece on here by, what is his name? I think it's Neil Larson. That's like an extended critique of Walter Mignolo and the authoritarianism of a lot that the authoritarian conclusions that he comes from his decolonial position. The piece is titled The Jargon of Decoloniality. Quote, epistemologies, end quote, are only compared in terms of power theory, hegemonic or subaltern, no longer in terms of content. The aim is the, quote, epistemic equivalence and equality, end quote, of all ethnically rooted forms of knowledge. Quote, the ultimate goal, decolonial speaking, end quote, says Nidlovu Gatsheni, quote, is to put all onto-epistemic traditions in a non-dominant and equal position for the purposes of enriching human life in its diversity, end quote. So-called subaltern forms of knowledge are supposed to represent, quote, narratives that are incommensurable with Western thinking and are sometimes placed alongside Western forms of knowledge. Dipesh Chakrabarty's example is the religious belief of the Santal from India, who started an uprising in the mid-19th century supposed at the behest of their god, Thakur. It would therefore be epistemically unjust to understand the Santal as actors with religious beliefs. The epistemically just approach would be to take the Santal narrative seriously, unless regard not the Santal, but their god, Thakur, as the actor, and place this, quote, epistemology, end quote, on equal footing with the historiographical secular one. Since epistemologies are assigned to ethnic spaces, and the equality of these epistemologies, not of individuals, is demanded, the problem of the inauthentic, quote, West-toxicated, end quote, culturally alienated speaker automatically arises as soon as, for example, an African dares to criticize the, quote, African form of knowledge. Quote, in politics, end quote, asserts Hull, quote, epistemic ethno-nationalism represents a challenge to the liberal idea that it is right for citizens to adopt beliefs and values based on their own appraisal of the evidence and their own convictions, end quote. Criticism of ethno-culturally specific patterns of interpretation exercised by outsiders sometimes even falls under the category of, quote, epistemicide, end quote. We are dealing here with an attack on universal, quote, individual reason, end quote, in the name of, quote, national reason, end quote. That denotes nothing other than a culturally relative, contingent tradition reminiscent of the European radical conservatism of Joseph de Maistre. Writing in 1794, he noted that one should unconditionally submit to the prevailing, quote, national reason, end quote, the revealed faith and moral bond of the fathers. Otherwise, one would be postulating ideas that are alien and culturally corrosive. In this sense, Nulovu Gatsheni also calls for the de-Westernizing of Africans by African university teachers with an African consciousness. Ultimately, this conception of knowledge is inconsistent because the assertion that all knowledge systems are only culturally specific is supposed to be true across cultures. On the one hand, as Hull summarizes the self-contradiction of the decolonial approach, it is claimed that the subalterns have the privilege of knowledge. Mignolo even speaks of the, quote, awareness of the coloniality of being, and knowing determined by the body of the colonial subject, end quote, which the actors on the dominant side are unable to achieve due to their embodied experience, and that decolonial theory is an accurate analysis of at least 500 years of Western coloniality. On the other hand, it is assumed that this goes along with the universally valid realization that all knowledge is only valid relative to culture, body, and place. In the more moderate variant of this approach, ethnically and geopolitically embodied interpretations of the world in a, quote, dialogue, between all peoples of the world, end quote, are supposed to produce a, quote, better interpretation of the world than Western universalism, which denies itself in its particularity. How this is supposed to be possible and what logic this desired dialogue between peoples, not individuals, is supposed to follow remains unclear. Here, too, a self-contradictory relativism remains the ultimate consequence. Politically, coloniality and liberal democracy are seen as two sides of the same coin. In many post-colonial approaches, what is to supersede, quote, colonial modernity, end quote, however, is still unknown. Often, with direct reference to fascist thinker Carl Schmitt, a multipolar world order is praised as an alternative along the lines of left-wing ethno-pluralism. And that's precisely what Neil Larson criticizes Mignolo for. I don't know if Mignolo is going to be talked about as like the here, but that's definitely a position of his, celebrating like I forget what they call it, the Chinese and Russian states as like civilizational states or something like that. I can't remember. I'd have to listen to the recording again, but it's something to the effect of these being like celebrating these things as like counterpowers to the U.S. hegemony. Often with direct reference to fascist thinker Carl Schmitt, a multipolar world order is praised as an alternative along the lines of left-wing ethno-pluralism, thus providing legitimacy to authoritarian power blocks such as Russia, China, or Iran. Such, quote, alternative modernities, end quote, are to be achieved through hybridity. This means that allegedly or actually, colonized peoples should subversively reinterpret concepts such as human rights or democracy from their specific ethno-cultural perspective. Culturally specific human rights or, quote, Islamic, forms of democracy, end quote. Gersfiguel, thus become desirable goals in the fight against Western hegemony. This almost inevitably leads to ideological alliances between post-colonial leftists and jihadists. Take as examples the unequivocal statements of leftist protagonists. Judith Butler believes that, quote, understanding Hamas and Hezbollah as social movements that are progressive on the left, part of a global left, is extremely important. Others, such as the postmodern star philosopher Gianni Vattimo, have called for money to be raised to, quote, buy Hamas some more rockets, end quote, or even want to lend a hand themselves. Quote, I'd like to shoot those bastard Zionists, end quote. Gianni Vattimo. Susan Buckmore strives for an alliance between critical theory and Islamist thinkers such as Sayyid Qutb, which must carry out a, quote, attack launched both from within and without, end quote, against liberal capitalist modernity. Footnote, see Susan Buck-Morss, Thinking Past Terror, Islamism and Critical Theory on the Left, published in 2003. God, that's so fucking stupid. And Mignola believes that, quote, Arab Islamic thinkers, Sayyid Qutb, Ali Shariati, Ayatollah Khomeini, end quote, have, quote, clearly formulated decoloniality, end quote. Mignola. There's a footnote that I missed here. See Mira Nanda, Prophets Facing Backward, Postmodernism, Science, and Hindu Nationalism. Nanda criticizes concepts of, quote, hybrid or, quote, alternative modernities, which he understands as immunization strategies for anti-democratic and anti-liberal collectivisms and authoritarian regimes. Mira Nandi demonstrates that postmodern science studies, feminist standpoint theories, and post-colonial theories of, quote, epistemic equality, end quote, with their vote for the dissolution of the validity of scientific statements into cultural genesis, for non-dualism, holism, anti-individualism, demonstrate strong convergences with the, quote, reactionary modernism, end quote, of right-wing Hindu nationalism. End footnote. Conclusion. There is clear evidence in the text of the most prominent post-colonial thinkers that this current of thought is imbued with fundamental anti-Western and anti-Israel bias, which was already present in Edward Said's foundational writings. The demonization of Israel and the West as a whole, as a colonial and therefore illegitimate power bloc, the Manichaean juxtaposition of indigenous peoples and colonial masters, and the ignoring of the agency and ideologies of actors from the global South are leading to a way of thinking that sees massacres such as the 7th of October and global Islamist terror targeting Jews as understandable, sometimes even welcome, quote, decolonial practices by powerless subalterns. In their thinking, widely respected post-colonial academics foment a longing for, quote, redemption through violence and death, at the risk of playing into the hands of reactionary, even fascist movements, end quote. And that quote is from Choat. I forget what that guy's first name is. Hold on, let me see. It's here. Gotta find the first citation because he was cited earlier. Come on. He wrote a book called Is Theory Good for Jews? Fuck. God, what the hell? It's like, I think it's like Bruno Choate. Yeah, Bruno Choate. Or Choa. I don't know how, or Showa. I don't know how to say his name. I think he's French. Is Theory Good for the Jews? French Thought, The Challenge of the New Anti-Semitism, published in 2020. So that's the end of the piece. Thank you for listening.